In 1943, somewhere in occupied Norway, a single cook armed with nothing but a bottle of laxative brought an entire SS platoon to its knees without firing a single shot. While his name has been lost to history, his act of culinary warfare became one of the most bizarre yet effective cases of resistance sabotage during World War II. This wasn't a trained commando or a hardened resistance fighter. This was an ordinary man who worked in the kitchen of a requisitioned hotel, forced to serve the very soldiers who had invaded his homeland. But on one cold winter morning, he decided that if he had to feed the enemy, he would make damn sure they regretted every spoonful. What happened next turned a routine breakfast into a military disaster that left dozens of elite Nazi soldiers completely combat ineffective for days. And the story of how he pulled it off reveals just how creative everyday people became when fighting back against tyranny. Norway in 1943 was a nation strangled by occupation. The Germans had invaded 3 years earlier, sweeping through the country in a lightning campaign that left the Norwegian military shattered and the government in exile. By the middle of the war, the occupation had settled into a grim routine. German forces controlled every major city, every port, every road. The SS, Hitler's elite paramilitary force, had established a particularly brutal presence throughout the country, tasked with crushing any hint of resistance and hunting down partisans in the frozen wilderness. For ordinary Norwegians, life became a careful dance between survival and collaboration. You kept your head down, you followed the rules, and you tried not to draw attention. Those who resisted openly faced torture, execution, or deportation to concentration camps. The resistance movement existed, of course, operating in the shadows, but it was dangerous work that could get your entire family killed. In this suffocating atmosphere, hotels and restaurants throughout Norway's cities were requisitioned by German military command to house officers and troops. These weren't just any soldiers. Many of these facilities hosted SS units, men who wore the death's head insignia and enforced the Reich's most ruthless policies. The local staff, the cooks, the cleaners, the servers, had no choice but to continue working. Refusing meant losing your only source of income, or worse, being labeled as uncooperative and facing imprisonment. So they showed up every day, prepared meals, made beds, and served breakfast to men who represented everything they hated. The indignity burned. Every morning, Norwegian cooks would prepare rich meals using ingredients that ordinary citizens could only dream of. Butter, meat, fresh bread, luxuries that had disappeared from Norwegian tables flowed freely into German mouths. The occupation forces ate like kings, while the occupied population survived on rations and scraps. Our protagonist was one of these cooks. Records suggest he worked at a hotel in one of Norway's coastal cities, possibly Trondheim or Bergen, though the exact location remains unclear. What we know is that he was middle-aged, experienced in his trade, and like every other Norwegian, he was tired. Tired of the occupation, tired of serving the enemy. Tired of watching SS officers laugh and drink while his neighbors went hungry. He wasn't a member of any organized resistance cell. He had no contact with British intelligence, no training in sabotage, no access to weapons or explosives. But he had something just as valuable in that moment. He had access to their food, complete trust from his German supervisors who barely paid attention to the kitchen staff, and a working knowledge of basic chemistry that any cook would possess. Most importantly, he had reached that dangerous point that occupiers always fear. The point where the consequences of action seemed no worse than the humiliation of inaction. The plan formed over days, maybe weeks. It had to be simple. Anything complex would be noticed, would leave traces, would get him caught. Poison was too obvious and would lead to immediate reprisals against the entire Norwegian staff and probably the surrounding neighborhood. No, it needed to be something that would cause chaos but not death, something that could plausibly be explained as food gone bad or a stomach illness. Laxatives were the answer. In sufficient quantities, they would render soldiers completely incapacitated without killing them. Even better, the symptoms wouldn't appear immediately. By the time the SS realized something was wrong, identifying the source would be nearly impossible. He could obtain laxatives from local pharmacies without raising suspicion, a little here, a little there, claiming digestive issues. He began stockpiling, crushing pills into powder, waiting for the perfect opportunity. That opportunity came on a morning when an entire SS platoon, roughly 30 to 40 men, was scheduled to be served breakfast before a planned operation in the surrounding countryside. The cook arrived early, as always, and began preparing the morning soup, a thick, hearty mixture that was a staple of the German military diet. As the large pot simmered on the stove and the kitchen filled with steam, he retrieved his hidden stash of powdered laxative. His hands were steady as he emptied bottle after bottle into the bubbling liquid, stirring carefully to ensure even distribution. The amount he used was staggering, far beyond any medical dose, enough to turn the digestive system into a war zone. When the soup was served, the SS officers and soldiers consumed it eagerly, complimenting the kitchen on the flavor. Within 2 hours, the entire platoon was combat-ineffective, confined to latrines, doubled over in agony, unable to stand for more than minutes at a time. The scheduled operation was cancelled. The hotel descended into chaos. The chaos that erupted in that hotel on that winter morning in 1943 was unlike anything the SS officers had experienced. These were men trained to endure hardship, soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front, who had participated in brutal campaigns across Europe. But nothing in their military training had prepared them for the absolute physiological catastrophe that overwhelmed their bodies within hours of finishing breakfast. The first soldier to feel the effects dismissed it as a minor stomach upset, excusing himself from the morning briefing. Within 20 minutes, 3 more followed. Within an hour, the entire platoon was racing to bathrooms, storage rooms, anywhere with even a semblance of privacy. The hotel's limited facilities became a battlefield of a different kind. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder in combat now fought each other for access to toilets. Officers abandoned all pretense of dignity, their authority dissolving as their bodies betrayed them in the most humiliating way possible. The German command initially suspected food poisoning, a reasonable conclusion given that an entire unit had been struck down simultaneously. The hotel manager was summoned immediately, interrogated with the kind of intensity that made it clear lives hung in the balance. Kitchen staff were lined up and questioned one by one. Our cook stood among them, his face a mask of confused concern, playing the role of bewildered servant perfectly. He suggested perhaps the milk had gone bad, or maybe the meat had been slightly off. Other staff members, genuinely ignorant of what had happened, offered their own theories. The Germans brought in a military doctor who examined the food stores, inspected the kitchen, and took samples of everything. But laxatives leave no trace once dissolved, no telltale smell, no discoloration. The soup had been consumed entirely, the pot already washed and cleaned as part of normal kitchen routine. There was nothing to find. While the investigation continued, the afflicted soldiers remained incapacitated for the better part of 3 days. The initial violent phase lasted nearly 24 hours, during which most of the platoon could barely function. Even after the worst symptoms subsided, weakness, dehydration, and continued digestive distress kept them off duty. The military operation they were supposed to conduct, likely an anti-partisan sweep through the surrounding forests, had to be postponed and then reassigned to another unit. In the brutal mathematics of warfare, 35 to 40 combat-ineffective soldiers for 72 hours represents a significant tactical loss. These weren't rear echelon clerks or supply personnel. These were frontline SS troops, temporarily removed from the German order of battle without a single bullet being fired. For a resistance movement that had limited access to weapons and explosives, the strategic value of such sabotage was enormous. The investigation eventually concluded with no definitive answer. The official report likely blamed contaminated ingredients or improper food storage, a bureaucratic solution that allowed the German command to save face while avoiding the uncomfortable possibility that they had been deliberately sabotaged under their own roof. The kitchen staff received stern warnings about food safety, and operations continued. Our cook returned to his station, preparing meals as he always had, his expression neutral, his hands steady. Nobody suspected him. Why would they? He was just a cook, a middle-aged Norwegian tradesman who showed up every day and did his job. The Germans couldn't conceive that someone so ordinary, so seemingly powerless, would possess both the courage and the cunning to strike such a blow. They were looking for professional saboteurs, resistance cells, British agents. They never considered that the greatest threat might be the man who served their breakfast. What the Germans also failed to realize was that news of the incident spread through the Norwegian underground like wildfire. Kitchen workers talked to family members, who talked to neighbors, who talked to resistance contacts. Within weeks, the story of the laxative soup had become legend in occupied Norway, whispered in homes and shelters, shared with dark humor and quiet pride. It became proof that resistance didn't always require guns or bombs. Sometimes it required nothing more than access, opportunity, and the willingness to act. Other kitchen workers in other hotels and restaurants heard the story and began considering their own options. The psychological impact on the Norwegian population was significant, a reminder that even in the depths of occupation, the occupied were not entirely powerless. For the Germans, it planted a seed of paranoia that never quite went away. If their food could be weaponized, what else could be turned against them? The true genius of what this cook accomplished wasn't just the act itself, but the careful calculation that made it possible. Sabotage during wartime occupations typically followed predictable patterns. Resistance fighters would target infrastructure, blow up rail lines, assassinate collaborators, or steal weapons. These acts were dramatic, effective, and almost always resulted in savage German reprisals. The Nazi policy of collective punishment was well established by 1943. For every German soldier killed, 10 or 20 civilians would be executed. For every act of sabotage, entire neighborhoods could be rounded up and sent to camps. The mathematics of resistance were brutal and unforgiving. Any act of defiance had to be weighed against the likely cost in innocent lives. This is what made the laxative attack so brilliantly subversive. It caused genuine military damage without crossing the line into lethal violence that would trigger mass executions. The cook understood something fundamental about human nature and military bureaucracy. The SS officers who had been incapacitated were humiliated, angry, and desperate to identify the culprit. But they were also deeply embarrassed. There is no dignified way to report to your superiors that your entire platoon was defeated by digestive distress. The image of elite SS soldiers, men who wore the death's head and considered themselves the master race, brought low by bad soup, was not something the German command wanted to publicize. It undermined the aura of invincibility that the occupation relied upon. So while the investigation was thorough, there was also a quiet institutional desire to resolve the matter quickly and move on. If the Germans had discovered that this was deliberate sabotage, they would have had no choice but to respond with overwhelming force. But as long as it could be attributed to accident or negligence, it could be handled internally without alerting the wider resistance network or encouraging copycat attacks. This strategic ambiguity was the cook's shield. He had created just enough plausible deniability to survive. The Germans wanted to believe it was an accident because the alternative was too troubling. If a simple cook could strike at them with such effectiveness, it meant their security was compromised at the most basic level. It meant they couldn't trust anyone, not even the people who prepared their food. The paranoia this generated was its own form of psychological warfare. After the incident, German officers throughout Norway began viewing their local staff with increased suspicion. Some units brought in their own German cooks, straining already stretched personnel. Others demanded that Norwegian kitchen workers taste every dish before it was served, a humiliating ritual that only deepened the resentment. The occupation became marginally more difficult, marginally more expensive, marginally more exhausting for the occupiers. Meanwhile, our cook continued his work as if nothing had happened. This required extraordinary nerve. Every day, he returned to that kitchen, prepared meals for the same SS officers who had been investigating him, and maintained the fiction of loyal service. He couldn't afford to change his behavior in any way that might draw suspicion. He couldn't quit his job, couldn't be seen celebrating, couldn't even confide in most of his fellow staff members. The isolation must have been crushing. He carried the knowledge of what he had done alone, unable to share the victory, unable to seek recognition. This is the hidden cost of resistance that history often overlooks. The heroes who survived were often those who could endure not just the danger of their actions, but the silence that followed. The incident also revealed a broader truth about resistance under occupation. The Norwegian resistance is often remembered for its dramatic operations, the heavy water sabotage at Vemork, the intelligence networks that fed information to the Allies, the commando raids launched from Britain. These were crucial contributions to the war effort, and deservedly famous. But beneath these headline operations was a vast network of smaller acts of defiance, each one insignificant on its own, but collectively representing a constant drain on German resources and morale. A secretary who deliberately misfiles documents, a railway worker who reports equipment failures that don't exist, a telephone operator who connects calls just slowly enough to frustrate German efficiency, a fisherman who provides slightly inaccurate information about coastal defenses, and yes, a cook who turns breakfast into a weapon. These acts didn't win the war, but they made occupation harder, more expensive, and more demoralizing for the occupiers. To understand why this single act of culinary sabotage carried such weight, you have to understand what Norway represented to the German war machine by 1943. This wasn't just occupied territory. Norway's coastline provided crucial U-boat bases that threatened Allied shipping in the North Atlantic. The country's fjords offered protected harbors for the German surface fleet, including the battleship Tirpitz, whose mere presence tied down significant British naval resources. Norwegian hydroelectric plants and industrial facilities contributed to the Reich's war production. Most critically, the heavy water facility at Vemork was central to German atomic research. Norway wasn't a backwater occupation. It was strategically vital, which meant Germany had to maintain a substantial military presence to defend it against both external Allied threats and internal resistance. The SS units stationed throughout Norway served multiple functions in this occupation apparatus. They weren't just soldiers, they were the enforcers of Nazi ideology, responsible for suppressing resistance, hunting partisans, and implementing racial policies. The particular platoon that our cook targeted would have been involved in operations against the Norwegian resistance, searching homes, conducting arrests, interrogating suspects. These were men whose effectiveness directly impacted the safety of resistance fighters and the security of underground networks. When that platoon was taken off the board for 3 days, operations were delayed, intelligence gathering was interrupted, and planned raids had to be postponed. In the high-stakes chess game of occupation and resistance, even temporary removal of enemy pieces created opportunities. The cook's access to his targets was a product of German arrogance and a fundamental misunderstanding of occupied populations. The Nazis viewed Norwegians as fellow Aryans, racially acceptable even if politically misguided. This meant that unlike in Poland or Russia, where German forces often brought their own support staff or relied on carefully vetted collaborators, in Norway they felt comfortable using local labor for everyday tasks. Norwegian cooks, cleaners, and servers were considered trustworthy enough to handle food preparation, logistics, and housekeeping for German military facilities. This was a catastrophic security failure dressed up as racial ideology. The Germans created a situation where the people they had conquered, people who had every reason to hate them, had intimate daily access to their food, their quarters, and their routines. They assumed that fear and military superiority would guarantee compliance, but fear cuts both ways. While the occupied feared German reprisals, the Germans gradually developed their own fear of the occupied population. Every interaction with locals became a potential security risk. The cook who seemed so cooperative might be planning sabotage. The cleaning woman who smiled politely might be gathering intelligence. The hotel manager who appeared helpful might be passing information to resistance networks. This erosion of trust made the occupation progressively more difficult. German soldiers couldn't relax in their own facilities. They couldn't assume that basic services were safe. The mental strain of constant vigilance, of treating every Norwegian as a potential threat, wore down morale and effectiveness. Our cook's attack accelerated this process, transforming a theoretical vulnerability into a demonstrated reality. The psychology of the attack was as important as its physical impact. Laxatives are fundamentally humiliating. They rob you of dignity, reduce you to your most basic biological functions, and render you helpless in a way that is somehow worse than a battlefield wound. A soldier injured in combat can take pride in his sacrifice. But there is no glory in being defeated by your own digestive system. The SS soldiers who suffered through those 3 days weren't just physically incapacitated. They were psychologically diminished. They had been made ridiculous. Word of the incident, even in sanitized official form, would have spread through the German military network in Norway. Other soldiers would have heard that an entire SS platoon had been taken down by bad soup. The jokes, the mockery, the damage to the unit's reputation would have lingered long after the physical symptoms subsided. The cook had weaponized shame. The days following the attack required the cook to perform the most dangerous act of all: perfect normalcy. He woke at the same hour, arrived at the hotel kitchen at the same time, prepared the same dishes with the same efficiency. When German officers walked past, he nodded respectfully. When supervisors gave instructions, he followed them without hesitation. This performance was not optional. Any deviation from his established pattern, any hint of satisfaction or nervousness, could reignite suspicion. The investigation might have officially concluded, but eyes were still watching. The hotel manager, himself under intense pressure from German command, scrutinized the kitchen staff more carefully than before. Fellow Norwegian workers, unaware of what had really happened, might have noticed any change in behavior and mentioned it innocently during another round of questioning. The cook had to bury his triumph so deeply that even he almost forgot it existed. This kind of sustained deception takes a psychological toll that most people cannot comprehend. Imagine knowing that you have struck a genuine blow against an occupying force that has crushed your nation, that you have accomplished something meaningful in the face of overwhelming power, and yet you cannot celebrate, cannot share, cannot even acknowledge it to yourself in any visible way. The human need for recognition is profound. Soldiers receive medals. Resistance fighters, when successful, are celebrated by their networks. But kitchen saboteurs like our cook operated in absolute isolation. He couldn't tell his wife, if he had one, because loose talk in a moment of intimacy could spread. He couldn't confide in other kitchen workers because he couldn't know who might crack under interrogation. He certainly couldn't contact any organized resistance cells because he had no connections to them, and establishing contact now would create a trail leading directly back to the hotel. The irony was that his isolation was also his protection. The Germans were looking for networks, for cells, for organized conspiracies. Their interrogation techniques and investigation methods were designed to break down group resistance, to find the weak link in a chain of collaborators. But there was no chain. There was just one man who had made a decision, executed a plan, and returned to his normal life. The Gestapo's sophisticated apparatus for rooting out resistance was optimized for a different kind of threat. They could infiltrate organizations, turn informants, track communications, but they couldn't easily identify a lone actor who left no traces and told no one. The cook's loneliness was his armor. Meanwhile, the German military presence in the hotel gradually returned to its routine. New SS units rotated through, officers came and went. The platoon that had been incapacitated eventually recovered and resumed operations, though likely with a lingering wariness about hotel food. The cook continued preparing meals, each day identical to the last, but something had fundamentally changed in the balance of power, even if only he could see it. He had proven to himself that resistance was possible, that the Germans were not invincible, that cleverness could triumph over military might. This knowledge sustained him through the remaining years of occupation. When he prepared breakfast for German officers, he knew that he was not merely a servant. He was a saboteur who had chosen for now to remain dormant. The option to strike again remained, a hidden weapon that existed purely in his mind. This is where the story becomes particularly fascinating from a historical perspective. We don't know if he struck again. Records from occupied Norway document numerous cases of suspected food tampering, mysterious illnesses among German troops, and unexplained incidents at military facilities. Some of these were certainly accidents, the natural result of strained supply chains and deteriorating food quality as the war dragged on. But some were almost certainly deliberate. The laxative attack demonstrated that such sabotage was possible and effective. It's entirely plausible that our cook, emboldened by success, found other opportunities. It's equally plausible that he decided once was enough, that he had tested his luck and survived, and that pushing further would be suicidal. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that he survived the war, his identity protected by the anonymity that saved his life. The broader impact of this incident extended far beyond one incapacitated SS platoon. In the underground networks of occupied Norway, where information traveled through whispers and coded messages, the story of the laxative soup became something more valuable than a simple tale of successful sabotage. It became a blueprint. Resistance organizers recognized immediately what this anonymous cook had discovered: that non-lethal sabotage targeting German comfort and efficiency could be just as strategically valuable as armed attacks, with a fraction of the risk. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, there was a documented increase in reports of German troops suffering from unexplained digestive illnesses, particularly in coastal cities where hotels and restaurants served as military quarters. Not all of these incidents can be attributed to deliberate action, but the pattern is suggestive. The cook had opened a new front in the resistance war, one fought not with explosives and bullets, but with access and opportunity. The beauty of this form of resistance was its scalability and deniability. Unlike bombing a bridge or assassinating an officer, which required specialized skills, weapons, and planning, kitchen sabotage required only materials that were readily available and a position that thousands of Norwegians already held. Cooks, servers, cleaning staff, laundry workers all had access to German facilities and supplies. The laxative attack proved that these positions, which the Germans viewed as menial and beneath security concern, were actually positions of tremendous tactical power. A cleaning woman could report on troop movements observed while making beds. A laundry worker could identify unit insignias and numbers from uniforms. A server could overhear strategic discussions during meals. And a cook could turn the most basic necessity of military life, food, into a weapon. The Germans had inadvertently armed their enemies by treating occupied populations as invisible servants. What made this form of resistance particularly effective was the difficulty of German response. After lethal attacks, the Nazis could and did execute hostages, burn villages, and implement collective punishment that terrorized populations into submission. But how do you respond to soup that makes your soldiers sick? Mass executions over stomach illness would look absurd and would only generate more resistance. Replacing all Norwegian workers with German personnel was logistically impossible given manpower shortages. Installing food tasters, which some units did implement, was humiliating and only partially effective. The Germans found themselves in a bind. They needed local labor to maintain their occupation infrastructure, but that very labor force had become a security liability. Every meal became a potential threat. Every cleaning supply could hide contraband. Every smile from a Norwegian worker could mask burning hatred and careful planning. The psychological warfare aspect of these attacks cannot be overstated. German soldiers stationed in Norway were already dealing with significant stress. They were far from home, stationed in a cold and hostile environment, surrounded by a population that despised them, and under constant threat from both the organized resistance and Allied commandos. The knowledge that even their food might be weaponized added another layer of anxiety to an already tense situation. Soldiers began refusing certain dishes, demanding to see food prepared, insisting on eating only from sealed rations. This paranoia degraded unit cohesion and made the occupation feel even more like enemy territory. The Germans never achieved the level of control in Norway that they maintained in other occupied countries, and incidents like the laxative attack were a significant reason why. The cook's success also highlighted a crucial lesson about asymmetric warfare that resistance movements worldwide would later adopt. When facing a superior military force, you don't fight on their terms. You don't meet tanks with rifles or try to match their firepower. Instead, you exploit their vulnerabilities, attack their assumptions, and turn their strengths into weaknesses. The Germans were militarily superior, but that superiority required logistics, supply lines, and basic services. By targeting these unglamorous necessities, resistors could inflict disproportionate damage. A single cook with a bottle of laxative achieved what a squad of commandos with explosives might not have. He removed an entire SS platoon from combat effectiveness without triggering reprisals, without exposing a resistance network, and without sacrificing his own life. That's not just sabotage, that's strategic genius born from desperation and courage. By late 1944, the strategic situation in Norway had shifted dramatically. Allied victories across Europe meant that German forces were increasingly isolated and defensive. The Norwegian resistance had grown bolder, conducting more frequent sabotage operations with support from British Special Operations executive agents parachuted into the country. But even as the tide of war turned against Germany, the occupation remained brutal and dangerous. The SS and Gestapo intensified their efforts to root out resistance networks, knowing that their time was running short, but determined to maintain control as long as possible. In this environment, every act of resistance carried heightened risk. The Germans had become more paranoid, more violent, and more willing to implement collective punishment. Our cook, still working in his hotel kitchen, would have felt this increasing tension daily. The final year of occupation brought particular hardships to Norwegian civilians. As Allied bombing disrupted German supply lines and the Reich diverted resources to defend the homeland, even basic necessities became scarce. Food rations shrank. Heating fuel disappeared. The contrast between German military consumption and Norwegian civilian starvation became even more pronounced. SS officers continued to enjoy meals prepared from requisitioned supplies, while Norwegian children went hungry. For kitchen workers like our cook, preparing lavish meals for the occupiers while their own families subsisted on bread and potatoes must have been an almost unbearable moral torture. The temptation to strike again, to use his access for another attack, would have been enormous. But so would the risk. The Germans were more watchful now, more suspicious, more likely to investigate any unusual incident with ruthless thoroughness. Whether he attempted another sabotage attack or chose to remain dormant through the war's final months, we cannot know with certainty. What historical records do show is that cases of food-related illness among German troops in Norway continued sporadically through 1944 and into the spring of 1945. Some of these were undoubtedly natural, the result of deteriorating food quality and stretched supply chains. But given the proven effectiveness of kitchen sabotage and the increasing desperation of the Norwegian population, it's statistically likely that at least some were deliberate. The laxative attack had demonstrated that such actions were possible, and in the context of total war against an occupying force, the moral calculus was clear. Anything that weakened the Germans brought liberation closer. The psychological burden on individuals engaged in this kind of resistance intensified as victory approached. Early in the occupation, when German defeat seemed impossibly distant, resistors could act with a kind of fatalistic courage. The war might last forever, so why not strike when opportunity arose? But by late 1944, liberation was visible on the horizon. Every resistance fighter, every saboteur, every underground network member faced the agonizing possibility of being caught and executed just weeks or months before freedom arrived. The temptation to simply survive, to keep your head down, and wait for the Allies to finish the job must have been overwhelming. Yet attacks continued. Kitchen workers continued to take risks. The cook, if he chose to act again, would have done so knowing that capture now meant dying within sight of victory. This period also saw the Germans becoming increasingly erratic and desperate in their occupation policies. Units that knew they were facing defeat sometimes became more brutal, lashing out at civilian populations in final acts of violence. Other units began quietly preparing for surrender, loosening their grip and becoming less vigilant. The inconsistency made resistance work even more unpredictable. An action that might have been overlooked by one German commander could trigger savage reprisals from another. Our cook would have had to read these shifting dynamics daily, evaluating whether his position remained secure, whether the Germans still trusted the hotel staff, whether another attack was possible or suicidal. Every morning when he arrived at the kitchen, he made a choice: resist or survive. For months or even years, He navigated this impossible decision, and somehow, against all odds, he made it through. May 8, 1945 brought liberation to Norway. German forces surrendered, and the 5-year occupation finally ended. In cities across the country, Norwegians poured into the streets in celebration, tearing down Nazi flags, embracing returning resistance fighters, and beginning the difficult process of reclaiming their nation. For our cook, liberation must have brought a complex mixture of relief, pride, and profound exhaustion. He had survived, he had resisted, and now finally he could stop performing the daily charade of loyal service to an enemy he despised. But liberation also brought complications for those who had engaged in quiet resistance. Unlike the celebrated commandos who had destroyed the heavy water plant or the resistance fighters who had battled German troops in the wilderness, kitchen saboteurs left no clear record of their actions. There were no medals waiting, no official recognition, no place in the victory parades. The immediate post-war period in Norway was consumed with reckoning and reconstruction. Collaborators faced trials and punishment. The most notorious Quislings, named after Vidkun Quisling, who had led the Nazi puppet government, were executed or imprisoned. But the vast majority of Norwegians occupied a morally ambiguous middle ground. They had neither heroically resisted nor actively collaborated. They had simply survived, doing what was necessary to protect themselves and their families. Our cook fell into this category, at least officially. His personnel file, if it still existed, would have shown nothing but dutiful service at a German requisitioned hotel. No suspicious incidents, no evidence of resistance activity, nothing to distinguish him from thousands of other Norwegians who had worked for the occupation apparatus out of necessity. This anonymity was both blessing and curse. It meant he avoided any accusations of collaboration or interrogation about his wartime activities, but it also meant his act of resistance remained unknown and unrecognized. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, when resistance fighters were sharing their stories and receiving acknowledgement for their courage, he remained silent. Perhaps he tried to tell someone, a family member or a friend, about what he had done. Perhaps he described the laxative attack expecting recognition or at least understanding. But without documentation, without witnesses who could confirm his story, without any official record, his claim would have seemed like fantasy or exaggeration. Thousands of Norwegians emerged from the occupation with stories of small acts of defiance, some true, some embellished, some entirely fabricated. How could anyone verify that an anonymous cook had actually incapacitated an SS platoon with laxative soup? It sounded absurd, almost comical, too bizarre to be believed. So the cook most likely returned to normalcy with his secret intact. He probably continued working in kitchens, perhaps at the same hotel once it was returned to civilian control, or perhaps elsewhere in Norway, struggling to rebuild its economy and infrastructure. The skills that had made him valuable to the German occupation made him valuable to the reconstruction as well. He cooked, he fed people, he went about his life, but he carried with him the knowledge of what he had accomplished, a private victory that shaped his understanding of himself, even if the world never acknowledged it. In quiet moments, perhaps, he allowed himself to remember. The weight of the laxative bottles in his hands, the careful stirring of the soup, the studied neutrality of his expression as German officers praised the meal, the barely suppressed satisfaction as the chaos unfolded. These memories belonged to him alone. The historical record preserves only fragments of his story. Norwegian resistance archives contain references to the incident, mentioned in passing as one of many sabotage actions during the occupation. German military reports from Norway, now declassified, include brief mentions of troop illness at various facilities, though most lack specific details. The pieces exist, scattered across different collections, but they don't form a complete narrative. They don't give us his name, his age, his hometown, or his fate. They don't tell us if he had a family, if he survived into old age, if he ever received any recognition for what he did. The anonymity that protected him during the occupation has erased him from history. He has become a ghost, a story, a legend whispered in the shadows of a war that produced countless unrecorded acts of courage. The erasure of stories like the cooks from official histories reveals something uncomfortable about how we remember resistance. We prefer our heroes to be dramatic, their actions cinematic, their sacrifices visible and documented. The commando who destroys a factory fits neatly into our narrative frameworks. The spy who steals secrets and narrowly escapes capture makes for compelling storytelling. But the cook who weaponizes soup? The cleaning woman who reports troop movements? The railway worker who causes strategic delays through deliberate inefficiency? These resistors operated in the mundane spaces of occupation, and their victories were small, unglamorous, and difficult to verify. Yet collectively, these thousands of minor acts of sabotage and defiance imposed a constant drain on German resources and morale that was arguably as significant as any single spectacular operation. Modern historians studying the Norwegian resistance have worked to recover these lost narratives, combing through fragmentary records, interviewing elderly Norwegians who remember the occupation, and piecing together the hidden history of everyday resistance. What emerges is a picture far more complex than the traditional heroic narrative. Yes, the heavy water sabotage at Vemork was crucial to preventing a Nazi atomic bomb. Yes, the intelligence networks that fed information to London were strategically vital. But the occupation was also resisted through 1,000 tiny cuts: kitchen workers who contaminated food, secretaries who lost important documents, dock workers who damaged cargo, postal employees who delayed military mail, telegraph operators who garbled messages. Each act individually trivial, but collectively creating an environment where the occupation never quite functioned smoothly, where German efficiency was constantly undermined by invisible hands. The laxative attack exemplifies this form of resistance at its most effective. Consider the asymmetry of the exchange. Our cook risked his life, certainly, but he used materials worth perhaps a few kroner, required no specialized training or equipment, and executed his plan in minutes. The Germans, in response, lost an entire platoon's combat effectiveness for 3 days, conducted extensive investigations consuming officer time and resources, implemented new security protocols that degraded efficiency, and suffered psychological damage that lingered far beyond the physical symptoms. The return on investment was extraordinary. This is the mathematics of asymmetric warfare that insurgent movements worldwide would later study and emulate. You don't need to match the enemy's strength. You only need to make occupation more expensive than the occupier is willing to pay. But there's another dimension to this story that deserves consideration: the moral courage required to act alone. Resistance fighters who operated in organized networks drew strength from their comrades, from the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. They could share the psychological burden, find support in moments of fear, and take comfort in collective purpose. Our cook had none of that. He made his decision alone, carried it out alone, and lived with the consequences alone. This kind of isolated resistance requires a particular kind of psychological strength. There's no group to validate your choice, no community to celebrate your success, no network to provide security or support. You act because you have decided it's necessary, knowing that success may never be acknowledged, and failure will likely mean death. The cook's story also illuminates the hidden cost of occupation that statistics and casualty figures cannot capture. Every Norwegian who worked for the German occupation apparatus faced an impossible moral dilemma. Refusing to work meant potential arrest, loss of income, and starvation for your family. But working meant collaborating with the enemy, serving the forces that had conquered your nation, enabling their continued control. Most people chose survival, and history should not judge them harshly for that choice. But some, like our cook, found ways to subvert the system from within. They served and sabotaged simultaneously, performing a dangerous balancing act that required constant vigilance and extraordinary nerve. These were not comfortable compromises. These were people living in a state of permanent moral tension, never able to fully reconcile their actions with their values. Understanding this complexity is essential to honestly confronting the reality of occupation. It's easy to celebrate resistance when it's dramatic and obvious. It's much harder to recognize and honor the quiet saboteur who maintains a facade of collaboration while undermining the enemy at every opportunity. Yet these individuals arguably faced greater psychological stress than open resistors. At least a partisan fighter in the mountains knew who they were and could act accordingly. The kitchen saboteur had to be two people simultaneously, the compliant servant and the determined resistor. That split consciousness, maintained over months or years, extracts a psychological toll that may never fully heal. Our cook, if he survived into old age, likely carried the weight of those years for the rest of his life, even if no one around him understood what he had endured. Today, more than 80 years after that winter morning in 1943, the story of the cook who weaponized laxative soup survives primarily as folklore. You won't find his name in major history books or on memorials to the Norwegian resistance. There are no statues commemorating his act, no plaques marking the hotel where it happened, no official recognition from the Norwegian government. The incident exists in the margins of history, mentioned occasionally in academic papers about occupation resistance, shared in online forums dedicated to World War II trivia, and passed down through Norwegian families as a piece of national legend. But the lack of formal recognition doesn't diminish what he accomplished. If anything, it makes the story more powerful. This wasn't someone seeking glory or fame. This was someone who saw an opportunity to strike at the enemy and took it, knowing full well that success would bring no reward beyond the private satisfaction of having acted. The broader lesson of this story extends far beyond World War II or occupied Norway. It speaks to a fundamental truth about power and resistance that remains relevant in any context where people face oppression or authoritarian control. The powerful always make the same mistake. They underestimate the agency of those they consider powerless. The SS viewed Norwegian kitchen workers as invisible servants beneath notice or concern. That contempt created a vulnerability that a clever individual could exploit. Throughout history, occupiers, dictators, and authoritarian regimes have consistently failed to recognize that the people who clean their floors, prepare their food, and manage their daily logistics possess both the means and potentially the motivation to resist. The cook's attack was successful precisely because it came from a direction the Germans never thought to defend against. This principle applies equally to modern contexts. In contemporary authoritarian states, the people who maintain the infrastructure of repression often occupy positions of hidden power. The secretary who handles classified documents, the IT worker who manages surveillance systems, the chef who prepares meals for political elites. These individuals are assumed to be compliant, either through fear or ideology. But history teaches us that compliance is often performance, and beneath the surface, resistance can take forms that authority never anticipates. The cook's story is a reminder that power is more fragile than it appears, and that clever individuals operating from positions of apparent weakness can inflict disproportionate damage when they choose to act. The story also carries a darker implication about historical memory and whose stories get preserved. We know about the heavy water sabotage because it involved Allied commandos, dramatic raids, and strategic significance that fit neatly into the war's grand narrative. We know about certain resistance fighters because they survived to write memoirs or because their actions were documented by the governments that supported them. But the vast majority of resistance actions during World War II were never recorded, never acknowledged, and never celebrated. The cook is not unique in being forgotten. He represents thousands of resistors whose names we'll never know, whose actions we can only infer from fragmentary evidence, whose courage has been erased by the passage of time and the priorities of historical documentation. Their absence from our history books doesn't mean they didn't exist or that their actions didn't matter. Perhaps the most important aspect of the cook's legacy is what it teaches us about the nature of courage itself. We tend to associate courage with dramatic, visible acts: the soldier charging into battle, the activist facing down armed police, the whistleblower exposing corruption despite personal cost. These forms of courage are real and deserve recognition, but there's another kind of courage that operates in silence and shadow. The courage to act when no one will ever know. The courage to risk everything for a small victory that might not even be recognized as resistance. the courage to maintain your humanity and your values in circumstances designed to strip both away. The cook possessed this quieter form of courage, and in some ways it's the most remarkable kind. He didn't act for glory or recognition. He acted because he could, because the opportunity presented itself, and because remaining passive felt like a greater betrayal than the risk of action. So when we tell the story of the cook who incapacitated an SS platoon with laxative soup, we're not just recounting an amusing anecdote from World War II. We're preserving a piece of resistance history that illuminates how ordinary people maintain their dignity and agency under extraordinary oppression. We're recognizing that heroism doesn't always look heroic, that resistance doesn't always involve weapons or violence, and that sometimes the most effective saboteurs are the ones nobody suspects. Most importantly, we're ensuring that even though we don't know his name, even though he never received recognition in his lifetime, even though official history has largely forgotten him, his act of defiance survives. Somewhere in occupied Norway, in the depth of winter in 1943, a cook stood over a pot of soup and decided that he would fight back with the only weapon he had. And for 3 days, an entire SS platoon paid the price for German arrogance. That story deserves to be remembered, to be told, and to inspire anyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of overwhelming force. Because the cook proved something essential. Power is an illusion, and sometimes all it takes to shatter that illusion is courage, creativity, and a bottle of laxatives.